Good morning. Am I on? Perfect. Perfect. Appreciate you all being here with us this morning as we start a new quarter. I'm looking for Mike. Johnny, he was up here and now he's gone. And Barry has we got new books, so there's Barry. Barry, you gonna count daily Bible readers? If you're a daily Bible reader, if you'll raise your hand, Barry will count you. Now I've got to give him a minute to write that down before he forgets. And now Barry has books. So if you didn't get a book last week for this quarter, raise your hand and Barry will get you a book. We'll have to pay Barry extra this morning since he had to do both. Double his pay. I'll mention while Barry's going and getting maybe a couple more books, the teachers this fall will be Josh, Dusty, Johnny, and myself. And then I think we'll be teaching in the fall and the spring quarter. And in the winter and the summer quarters, it'll be Jeremy, Eric, and we'll add Michael Hackett and Barry Cahoon to the rotation. So that'll be nice to get a couple new teachers in the rotation. It'll give some of those who've been teaching a while a break. Johnny, it's been a while since you've had a break, it seems like. So it'll be nice to have a couple new faces and give some other folks a rest. And of course, some that are taking a rest will actually be teaching downstairs, I think probably in at least one of those quarters. But anyway, that'll be the rotation. Sometimes I'm sure it seems like it's sort of random, and it's hard to keep up with the rotation probably if you're in the audience, and sometimes it's hard for those of us that teach to keep up with it, but that's kind of what we're going to be doing. Before we get started with our lesson, let's have a word of prayer. R.W., do you mind leading us in a word of prayer before we start?
Our God and Father, Heaven, we're so thankful for this first day of the week. We've been blessed with the opportunity to assemble here and study the Bible. We pray, Father, for all of those that have a question and interest in our prayers, especially those that are sick, like Scotty and others. We pray, Father, your blessings would be upon them. Bless us now as we study thy word. May we take this word and apply it to our lives to better serve thee. Continue to bless us and forgive us where we fail thee in Jesus' name.
Thank you, R.W. We're studying about the book of Exodus this quarter, and we'll be in chapter 1. And so you may want to open your Bibles because we're going to look at the whole chapter. The lesson doesn't cover the entire chapter. It cuts off, and I'm not sure why it cuts off, but we're going to go ahead and look at the entire chapter. Before we do, let's talk a little bit about Exodus. The word Exodus, what does it mean? Exit, yeah, it means an exit. So it's the story of God's people, the children of Israel, exiting Egypt. And not just the story of them exiting, but the preparations and the events that led up to their exit. And the book can kind of be divided in 3 sections. The first section being Israel in Egypt and all the things that happened to them while they were in Egypt. And the first few lessons this quarter are going to be dealing with Israel in Egypt and all those things that happened. The second section is Israel in the wilderness and their preparations and their marching towards the promised land, and took a little longer than expected, longer than it should have, because of their own actions and their own disobedience towards God. But the final section is Israel at Mount Sinai, and we'll look at least 1 or 2 lessons this quarter surrounding the events that took place at Mount Sinai. But this morning we're going to look at chapter 1 and the hardships that they endured, the suffering they endured while they were in Egypt, the seriousness of the servitude that they had while they were there. But before we read the chapter, let's talk a little bit about how they got to Egypt, about how Israel got to Egypt in the first place. Why were they there? that they had to leave. That word Exodus means exit, and some have said that this is a story of a people that had to go out so they could go in. Well, they had to go out of Egypt so they could go into the land of Canaan, but they had come from Canaan to start with. So how did they get from Canaan to start with to Egypt to now have to go back to the land of Canaan? Well, if you think back, early on in Genesis, we were introduced to Abraham. And God made a promise to Abraham. What was that promise? Do what? He's going to give him land. He's going to bless him as a people. His descendants are going to be more numerous than the stars in the sky. He's going to make him a great nation. Remember all those promises that were made to Abraham. Abraham had a son, Isaac. God repeated those same promises to Isaac. Isaac, I haven't forgotten. You're going to be a great nation. Isaac had a son, Jacob. Promises repeated again. God, haven't forgotten that promise. Jacob, you're going to be a great nation. I'm going to bless your descendants. They're going to be numerous. Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons was the favorite. Who was that? Joseph. And so if you have kids, you have a favorite, don't make it as obvious as Jacob did. Okay, Jacob made it obvious, and the other kids knew it. He had this special coat, this coat of many colors. And those other sons could look at Joseph and tell that he was the favorite. Probably was the favorite because he was the son of the favorite mother. Okay, all these kids were from different mothers, same father, Jacob, but Joseph was obviously the favorite. So there was jealousy, and the other brothers thought about killing Joseph. They were so jealous of him. Instead, they sold him into slavery, and Joseph wound up where? In Egypt. In Egypt. And if you haven't read that story, go back and read it because it's really interesting, all the things that happened to Joseph while he was in Egypt. He wound up in prison, even though he had done nothing wrong. God gives him the ability to interpret dreams, and through that ability, he got out of prison. Pharaoh had this dream about that Joseph was able to interpret, and the interpretation was, you're going to have 7 good years, 7 bad years, 7 good years of crops. Things are going to do really well. They're going to grow. Everybody's going to have plenty to eat. And you're going to have 7 bad years of famine where things don't grow, where there's nothing to eat. Joseph interprets that dream and says, Pharaoh, you might want to take advantage of those 7 good years and store some of that grain that you have. Pharaoh thinks that's a pretty good idea. Joseph, you're going to be in charge of it. So this young man who was sold into slavery by his own brothers rises up to become second in power in Egypt. And you see the providence of God in all the things that happens in Joseph's life, that he's able to come from near death, almost being killed by his brothers, to now he is second only to Pharaoh in power in Egypt. And if you remember back the story of the other brothers, those brothers that thought about killing him, they got hungry during the famine, had to go to Egypt to buy food, didn't recognize Joseph at first. Joseph has maybe a little bit of fun with his brothers before finally he introduces himself as Joseph, the one that they sold into slavery. Makes the comment at one point that, you meant this for evil, but God had different intentions. God meant this for good. And that's how Jacob and Jacob's sons wound up coming back to Egypt. Pharaoh gives them, land, and they're able to come back to Egypt where Joseph was. And that's how they kind of wound up in Egypt. And you can go back and read that story, and I would encourage you to do so. But Exodus kind of ends with that, and then Jacob dies in Egypt, Joseph dies, and we roll right into the book of Exodus. So let's read Exodus chapter 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the other Puah. And he said, When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. As I mentioned, back in Genesis, Jacob eventually came to live with Joseph. When Joseph revealed who he was to his brothers, they went back and told Jacob. And Jacob came with this group of 70, his sons and their wives and children and all that. It was a group of 70 that came. And the Egyptians were really welcoming to this group, because you think about Joseph and what he had done for the Egyptians, because he was able to interpret the dream that Pharaoh had. Their lives were saved. Had he not been able to interpret that dream, they would have just consumed everything in those 7 good years when they had plenty to eat. They wouldn't have stored back enough to get them through those 7 bad years. So Joseph was really respected, and Pharaoh really was in gratitude to Joseph. So if you go back and look in chapter 47 of Genesis, in verse 5, beginning in verse 5, it says, Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. So Pharaoh told Joseph, the land is yours. Go take the best of it for your family. You know, we sometimes call those who visit our assemblies, we say they're our honored guest, and certainly that's the case. Well, these brethren of Joseph were honored guests in Egypt. And that was the case as long as Joseph was alive. It was probably the case when the next Pharaoh who remembered who Joseph was, as long as he was alive, and maybe the next one who remembered Joseph. But eventually, and we don't know how long it was, but eventually there arose a Pharaoh who, according to verse 8, I think it is, did not know Joseph. And that Pharaoh probably, the authors speculate, probably wasn't from the same dynasty as that original Pharaoh that dealt so kindly with Joseph and Jacob and that family. It was probably a new dynasty that had taken over. But regardless of what the dynasty was, this person didn't have any loyalty to Joseph. or his descendants. And could have been hundreds of years, probably was several years before this happened, but eventually this Pharaoh rose who didn't care what Joseph did, didn't know Joseph, didn't really care for these Hebrews, these descendants of Jacob, because they were beginning to multiply. And the fear was that they might turn on the Egyptians. Or worse yet, they might side with some other group who came in and attacked the Egyptians. So we got to deal with these people. And this fear of losing power caused this king, this Pharaoh, to afflict the people. If you look at it in verse 10 of chapter 1, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. In verse 11, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with burdens. They have found images, the archaeologists have found images of these taskmasters whipping the Hebrews with whips to, I guess, encourage them to work faster, or maybe to punish them if they weren't working hard enough. But even still, what happened? Israel continued to grow. This nation that had started with 70 people, just Jacob and his sons and their families, continues to grow, continues to multiply. And I've always wondered, and I don't know if you've wondered this, I've always wondered why Jacob and his family had to leave Canaan and go to Egypt, and they had to suffer affliction all these hundreds of years just to go back to Canaan. You know, why couldn't they have just, if it was the promise that they were going to wind up in this promised land of Canaan, why couldn't they have just stayed there to start with? And I don't know that I can point at a book, chapter, and verse to say this, but one of the things I was reading kind of made this, I don't know if assumption's the right word, but kind of thought that had they stayed in Canaan, it would have been really hard for them to keep their identity. Because you think about the Canaanites and who they were a pagan people. They didn't mind intermarrying with other nations, and it would have been really hard for these 70 individuals to grow without intermingling, intermarrying with this pagan nation. On the other hand, in Egypt, the Egyptians were very, very closed. Okay, they didn't intermarry with other tribes, with other nations. So in Egypt, Israel could grow. The descendants of Abraham could not be, influenced and affected like they would have in Canaan. And so that's a theory. I don't know, like I say, I don't know that I can point to a book, chapter, and verse. I think also, just in my mind, another reason they had to go to Egypt and suffer these things is so they would learn to rely on God. So they would be maybe more appreciative when God does rescue them from what they had to deal with. Because as you read on, after they continue to grow, the Egyptians decide to make it even harder on them. I mean, they're out there quarrying rock, they're out there baking bricks, they're out there in the fields, and multiple times the text says the word rigor. It emphasizes that word rigor, that this isn't just work, this is hard work. And they're in bondage, they're in slavery. And as I read that, it makes it all the more puzzling, I guess would be the word, that they were barely out of Egypt before they started wanting to go back. And I've not read every lesson in this book, but I would venture to guess that there's probably going to be at least one lesson in this book where it's mentioned that the children of Israel complained and wanted to go back to Egypt, or made a comment along the lines of, oh, we had it better in Egypt, or it wasn't this bad in Egypt. I'm tired of eating all this quail and manna. We at least had something different to eat in Egypt. How quickly they forgot how bad things were. So when we get to that point, if we do study a lesson where that's mentioned, think back to this lesson. Think back to chapter 1 and how bad it really was And it's amazing. I mean, they were barely out of the shadows of Egypt before they started wanting to go back. And for us today, I think there's an analogy there, because if you read in the New Testament, you read the writings of Paul, he compares sin to bondage. And when we escape sin, we're escaping bondage just like Israel escaped bondage. But what do we sometimes do? We sometimes either go back, or in our minds we think, well, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe that previous life that I lived, I had a lot of fun back in those days. It wasn't so bad. And we forget just how bad sin is and how bad it was when we were lost, when we were without Christ. Like these people forgot just how bad it was in Egypt, in the bondage in which they were endured. Any comments so far? I'll stop a second and let you all make any comments you want to. Let's talk a little bit about these ladies. And I don't think the book necessarily emphasizes this. Again, I thought it cut it off a little early in the text. But these midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, it's possible that they weren't the only two midwives, probably likely that they weren't the only two midwives around. They might have been supervisors of a group of midwives, but they were given a command from the king of Egypt to kill the males. The females, if the females are born, they can live, but you kill the males. Now, I kind of wonder, well, why the males? Okay, why not? Why didn't you kill the females? Why do you kill the males? It takes both to reproduce, despite what some think, maybe. I guess the males would grow up to be fighters, would be kind of the thing that I would think about, and so they were less intimidated, maybe, at the thought of the daughters being born and living. So the king gives these women a command to do that, and they didn't follow the king's command. They didn't do that. In verse 17, the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. My girls, have a Bible storybook that's specifically about female heroes in the Bible. So it's got Deborah, and it's got Esther and Mary, and these female heroes that we typically think about. It doesn't have these two women. And maybe it should. Maybe we should focus a little more on these two women. There's all kinds of people in the Bible that we don't really think of as being main characters. But these two women, to me, are great heroes. And the faith that it took for them to not obey the commandments of this king. Any king who would give a command to kill children, to kill newborn babies, don't you think he wouldn't think twice about killing somebody who didn't obey his command? They put their lives in jeopardy by defying this king. And we could nitpick, I guess, their response to Pharaoh and say, well, maybe they kind of deceived Pharaoh. I won't say it was an outright lie, because the response they gave when the Pharaoh asked, why didn't you do what I told you to do? They said, well, the Hebrew women are stronger. And they have babies faster. Well, that could have very well been the truth. We don't necessarily know that was a lie, but they probably didn't tell the whole truth. They probably, were a little bit deceitful. But God was pleased with them. We know that God was pleased with them because He dealt well with them. He didn't allow them to be killed. In verse 21, because the midwives feared God, that He provided households for them. And it's worth pointing out that even though we don't always remember their names, they're here. They're listed here by name. What was the name of the king who gave that command? His name isn't listed. But these two midwives, they're preserved in history, Bible history forever. And sometimes we want to be famous. We want to be well known. We would probably rather have the position that the king had than the position that these midwives had. But the Bible doesn't look at it that way. The Bible doesn't. I think it's important to note that we don't know the king's name, but their names are remembered, and they feared God, and that led to their actions. The king also feared. He also had fear. What did he fear? Yeah, he feared losing power. He feared losing maybe his labor force if they turned against him. Certainly he feared that if they turned against him, he would lose probably his power. Fear motivated all the characters in this chapter. Fear motivated these two women. Fear motivated that king, but in very different ways. You know, he feared how's this going to affect me? They feared God. And that word fear is apparently a Hebrew word for piety, obedience, and trust. And in Genesis 22, that same word is used when God was talking to Abraham after Abraham was willing to offer his son as a sacrifice. God stopped him and said, "Now I know that you fear God." In Ecclesiastes, the very end, the very last chapter of Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. That fear God and that obedience go together. And fear drives a lot of people. Fear still drives a lot of people, but these women were driven not by how this is going to affect me, because again, they could have been killed. But they were driven by what would God want me to do, and I think that's really important and worth noting. On the other hand, it's easy for us to look at this king, this Pharaoh, and his decision to kill these male children and think, well, my goodness, how barbaric. And it was. You know, he was very barbaric by doing that, and we think, well, we're a lot more sophisticated than that. We're a lot more evolved than that. But then I think of the 50 million babies that we've killed in our nation since 1973. And I think maybe we're not so evolved. I think maybe we're not so sophisticated. And if you need a reminder of that, go home and Google partial birth abortion and read about that process. And if you can stomach the pictures, look at those pictures and be reminded of what we as a people have done to our children, and maybe we remember that we're not so sophisticated. We've not come as far as we think maybe we have since this Pharaoh tried to commit genocide against his own people. I just think that's worth pointing out and worth mentioning. He was barbaric, and we judge him harshly, and as well we should, but I think history is going to judge us as a people pretty harshly as well. But I think in this chapter, and really throughout the book of Exodus, we're going to continue to see God's hand, His providence, His compassion on His people. Yes, they had it terrible, but He has a plan for them. He had compassion on them, and we'll see that come to fruition. If you look back and you think about Joseph and what he went through, you think about that day when he was sold into slavery, and probably what he was thinking as his brothers talked about killing him and eventually sold him, he probably wasn't thankful to God at that moment. He probably wasn't thanking God as he was making that journey to Egypt. But God meant it for good. When Jacob and his sons were hungry for food because there was famine, and they had to go to Egypt to get food, they probably weren't thankful to God for the opportunity to go to Egypt and buy grain, but God meant it for good. And these people, as they're suffering in Exodus 1, as they're suffering in bondage, and their children are being killed, they weren't thankful, but ultimately God is going to intend this for good. This is a process in which they are going to grow in numbers. They're growing as a people, and will ultimately be their own nation that can sustain itself and go and take the nation that God had promised them. Any comments before we close? Well, again, I appreciate you being here and your good attention. Have a great day.